In Europe, the US, and elsewhere in the global north, the expectation that power is always there is so basic that it's worldwide news if a rich country goes a day without electricity that wasn't the result of the weather, like recently happened in Spain and Portugal, as I spoke about in this video. But in Africa, the situation is much different. And to this point, Decarbonize is focused on the global north. So let's turn our eyes elsewhere for a change. Let's focus on electricity in Africa, what's going on, and what can be done to improve the situation. And there is good news to share. Looking at the energy use per capita for the continents, we see that North Americans consume the most and Africans consume the least, less than 10% as much. In Africa, the number of people without this most basic element of modernity has grown. 60% of Africans have no access to electricity. And we see here that there is a strong correlation between gross domestic product, GDP, and energy consumption. Correlation does not prove causality. This doesn't tell us whether rich countries consume more energy because they can, or if they need to consume more energy to become rich countries, or some of both. But obviously, you can't have factories without consuming energy. If you don't have reliable electricity, how do you run even the most basic businesses? A bank or a doctor's office require reliable electricity. I'm not a huge fan of GDP as a metric for reasons that are beyond the scope of this video. So let's look at the Human Development Index, or HDI, which includes things like income, life expectancy at birth, and access to education. When we look at energy consumption versus HDI, we see an interesting thing. Higher energy consumption is correlated with higher levels of HDI until about 200 gigajoules per capita per year. From that point on, more energy consumption does not increase the HDI. And if we look at Africa, we see the countries there are firmly in the realm of energy poverty, that having more access to energy will improve their lives. The UN's 7th Sustainable Development Goal is, quote, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So how do we achieve this very worthy goal? A common mistake that people in the global north make is to treat Africa as a single country with the same situation everywhere, which makes as much sense as treating Europe as a monoculture. Just like Sweden and Italy have significant differences, Egypt and South Africa have very different histories and challenges. But just like Europe, there are some commonalities that are significant. The biggest is the enduring legacy of colonialism. From the 1870s to the years prior to World War I, Africa was carved up like a holiday turkey, with 7 European countries ruling over 90% of the continent. Every country other than Ethiopia and Liberia were ruled by European powers with no interest other than extracting wealth for the benefit of Europeans. During this period, indigenous power structures were either destroyed or corrupted to serve the needs of the extractive industries powering the Industrial Revolution in Europe and America, with inputs like rubber and coffee. During the Cold War, these countries gained independence, but with borders that were not drawn based upon tribal boundaries, which often led to internal conflict. Most of the departing countries, most notably France, left in place weak and unstable governments that would continue to act in the best interest of the former colonial power. Extractive industries continued to act against the best interests of the citizens in the countries which they operated. This brief history lesson is a gross simplification, an overview of a topic that covers centuries and is full of nuance. But to discuss the problems of Africa today, I think it's important to understand it in a historical context. While this entire channel is focused on decarbonization, me preaching to Africans that they must not use fossil fuels because they shouldn't contribute to climate change, while I use oil to heat my home, would be hypocritical. Upgrading Africa's grid to meet their needs should be the priority, and if fossil fuels are the best way to do that, they should be considered. But the ideal solution would be to support Africans having energy security while protecting both their local and global environment. And if there are additional costs to accomplish that in a carbon-free way, those costs should be borne by the US and Europe and the other societies that are responsible for the problem of climate change. Looking here, we see Africans get their electricity from coal, which has been stagnant, and methane, which is growing. Hydro is a significant player, which has been growing slowly. Only South Africa currently has any nuclear reactors, but Egypt is building one, and other countries are showing interest. We also see that as of 2022, there's very little coming from solar and wind. And remember, over half of Africans are getting no electricity, so the demand just to serve basic needs is much higher than is currently being supplied. In most of the world, including Africa, power is provided primarily from central power plants connected to transmission and distribution grids. These grids can span several countries and thousands of miles. An example of these plants is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Nile, which cost about $5 billion and 12 years to build, financed in part by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And the 12 years only counts construction time. The site was first identified as a good place to build a dam about 50 years before construction started. This dam can produce over 5 gigawatts of power, which is a significant fraction of all of the electricity produced in Ethiopia. This dam is very controversial, increasing tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia. Egypt depends on the Nile for water that is now being captured and used further upstream. According to the Energy for Growth Hub, there is very little coal power outside of South Africa, and only a handful of new coal plants are likely to be built. But for countries with methane reserves, fossil fuels will continue to be a big player. One estimate was 60% of new power will be coming from methane. But that's several years ago, and the cost of solar has been dropping so quickly that I expect that number is an overestimate. There's some interest in nuclear, but a lack of a trained workforce, robust supply chain, and regulatory framework make it unlikely that nuclear will be a big player in bringing power to the unserved masses. These large power plants are an efficient way to get power to cities and factories. But if your village isn't connected to the national grid, central power plants don't help very much. In Africa, more than 850 million people still depend on wood and charcoal for cooking. This has all sorts of negative impacts, including indoor air pollution, deforestation, and time spent gathering wood rather than in school or work. The most common solution is better stoves, which reduce these problems by burning the wood more cleanly and completely, but without eliminating any of them. But bringing electricity to the homes would provide energy for cooking, lighting, charging cell phones, and more. But the grid to do that, even if the power plants that could provide the power existed, just isn't there. Looking at this map of the existing high voltage transmission lines from the Africa Electricity Grids Explorer, we see that there are regions with little to no transmission lines and certainly not sufficient coverage to bring power to every village. A microgrid is a possible solution. Imagine a simple household system with a single solar panel, a battery, a hot plate, LED lights, and a cell phone charger. This can be transformative for the family without needing any grid. The next step up is a village-sized mini-grid. Here, you might incorporate a small wind turbine with the solar, leading to more reliable power. And the wiring only needs to cover the area of the village, which is much easier than wiring up a region powered by a large central power plant. One of the advantages of the microgrid approach is you can start small and build to connect into bigger and bigger grids. You start with 10 homes and add more homes until you're serving a village. Do that across many villages, then you have a district grid. As these systems grow, you can provide power to more applications like irrigation pumps or cooling for medicines, maybe charging e-bikes to improve transportation. So is this a realistic, scalable solution to reach the unserved majority of Africa? About 1/3 of homes getting electricity in sub-Saharan Africa in 2024 got power from these kinds of systems. So yes, this is a plausible solution. A metaphor that often comes up is that in Africa they never got landlines but went straight to cell phones. And maybe electricity will follow a similar path in rural Africa, skipping the centralized grid and building local grids based on solar panels and batteries. With the traditional system, you need to build a billion-dollar plant with billions spent to wire up a region, and it's 10 years before anyone sees any improvement. A home system can be installed in a few days, and a village-scale mini-grid can be implemented in weeks. Major donors like the World Bank and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative have focused on large projects. For instance, I reviewed the top 50 active projects of the World Bank in Africa around energy development, and over 80% of the funds were allocated to grid-tied projects. There are some smaller organizations like the UN Africa Mini Grids Program and Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa that are focused on off-grid solutions. But their budgets are in the millions, not the billions, like the World Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative. Given the paltry resources put into the off-grid solutions and the fact that a third of the new connections came from that approach, suggests that this is a viable and scalable solution to get everyone access to electricity. I'm not arguing there's no role for the grid in Africa, but these mini-grids are life-changing for the communities with no electricity, and the need to get power to everyone remains as critical as ever. So the next time your power goes out due to a storm, remember that in Africa, that's the reality every day for most people. If you have any thoughts on the challenges of bringing power to Africa, please share them in the comments. If you'd like to support my channel, you can buy me a stout or watch more of my videos on the electricity grid. And please forward this video to anyone you know who's complained about losing power after less than a day.